so gracious, way over the top. I am delighted to be with you for the next 50 minutes or so to talk about the topic that's really consuming me these days. We're going to talk about leading with connection. You, more than many other cohorts at UVA, have an experience of having gone through high school, often disconnected, doing it virtually, not able to maybe have the exact experience that you had envisioned. Before we jump into talking about connection and leading with connection, I want to talk a little bit about loneliness. So loneliness is on the rise. We've heard a lot about it because of the pandemic, but actually that's not when it started to be on the rise. The Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, who's actually he's serving his second stint as Surgeon General. After he finished his first tour of duty, he toured the United States because he really wanted to understand more about what was going on in all of the different corners of the country. And what he found was that he believed that there was a pandemic of loneliness before the pandemic that we know as COVID actually took place. And he ended up writing this book called Together, where he talked about the different ways in which we can build connection so that we can mitigate loneliness. So what is loneliness? This is going to be a little interactive. What is loneliness? You don't have to have perfect words. Yes. Lacking connection to other people, absolutely. So disconnection, and you'll hear me talk about that. What else? Yes. Yeah, feeling like there's no one that you can go to. Any other thoughts?
Having no support systems.
Having no support systems, absolutely. This is a definition, it's not the exclusive definition, but loneliness is commonly described as the negative feelings that emerge from a perceived gap between desired and actual relationships. And it's really important that it's perceived because for two different individuals, they may have the same set of interactions or lack of interactions, and they wouldn't experience the same amount of loneliness. So it really is based upon what we are looking for versus what we actually feel that we have. So as you said, loneliness can stem from disconnection. But why should we care? I mean, certainly, interpersonally why we would care, right? It has an impact on us. But why should we care more broadly? Why would we care at Batten, for those of us who are thinking about leadership, why would it actually matter? Well, we end up, so we know a lot of things about feeling less connected. So in recent studies, 65% of employees feel less connected than they used to. We know that disconnection drives voluntary turnover, and that just in the US, lonely employees actually cost $406 billion annually. So you might say, how does that happen? Well, there's some things that we know about lonely employees. So they're at risk of higher turnover, they're not as productive, they're more likely to miss days of work, and the work that they do is of lower quality. So there could be up to a loss of $52 million for a 10,000 person company per year from lonely employees. So that gets them attention. The Institute of Leadership and Management did a survey, and they found that for 77%, building close relationships was the top priority. Salary was actually number 8, which is often surprising to people. A Gallup poll indicated that only 30% of employees have a best friend at work. But for those employees who do have a best friend at work, they're 30% more engaged, they're more likely to engage customers, they produce better work, there's higher well-being, they're less likely to get injured. So could it be that the Great Resignation, which we are all hearing so much about, right? People rethinking their lives and what they want to do and their jobs and stepping down, is really the great disconnection? So if so, we need leaders who can help others become connected. But first, what would connection look like? So I want you to, just with the person sitting next to you, or it can actually be a triad, I want you to share your full name, and it can be your given, your chosen, your adapted name. How did you get it? What does it mean? And how do you feel about it? So think about like a minute and a half per person. Turn to each other. Is there anyone who hasn't shared yet about their name? So all of you have. So what did it feel like to share a little bit more about your name? Yes.
I kind of liked it, and I liked hearing from both of them, like, what they both had to say about their names, because our names are so personal to us, and, like, it's the way that we're most connected to other people. It's the way that other people know us. And so it's nice to kind of hear, like, the backstories on their names and, like, whether or not they like their names.
Yeah. Yes. So you got to go a little bit deeper on that. Absolutely. What else? Yes.
It makes me feel good when I share a part of myself and people listen and, like, acknowledge that they're listening.
Yeah.
Because then it obviously makes me feel connected to people, but it makes me feel like people care, and that's a good feeling to have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I was asking you a little bit about what it felt to share and like this notion of like people care, you get to go a little bit deeper. As you were hearing the people next to you talk more about themselves and share that, what was going through your head? Yeah. Absolutely. Are any of you sort of, friends that you do things outside of this class together, that you know each other beyond the class? Did you know about the sort of name story behind one another? A little bit. So excellent. That's great. You also knew? That's fantastic. Sometimes there are individuals who, I was actually talking to some executive MBAs, so they've been around for a little bit, and they were alums, and they came back, and I had them do this, and they said, we've known each other for 25 years, and I had no idea that that's how they actually got their name. And there was a little bit of an awakening in the sense of like, feeling known and understanding more about identities. This name exercise is relatively innocuous, right? We don't feel like we're making ourselves particularly vulnerable, although you certainly can share at a deeper and deeper level. But there's something about sort of knowing a little bit more about the person, and maybe you took some steps towards a deeper level of connection. So actively engaging and trying to form connections may actually be an antidote for loneliness. So what's connection? How would you define it? Yeah. Absolutely. Having a support system. What else? Yeah.
Having the ability to be like vulnerable with someone.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Having similarities. Great. Any other things? Here's a working definition. A positive emotion derived from actively engaging with another person, group, experience, even object or environment. That's frequently associated with a sense of comfort, a sense of well-being, and anxiety reduction, right? You could pick a number of things, but the interesting thing about it is that we can be connected to a place. Like, have you ever gone somewhere that you had been before and there's a flood of memories and for some reason you feel powerfully connected? Or there's a particular object, like something that you have on your desk or on your wall, and it reminds you of people and it makes you feel more connected. Or things that you do together, and that derives a sense of connection as well. So one more exercise. I just want you to think of a time when you felt particularly connected. So you've embarked on this new experience. Maybe think about who were the people that you met? Who did you feel connected to? What were those circumstances? Just reflect on it for a minute. So what did it feel like when you realized that you might be forming a connection? Well, what was that like? Yeah.
Like, it was kind of like clarifying.
Yeah.
Like a fog kind of cleared up. Like, other
Yeah, like sort of like there's a fog of people, and all of a sudden there's this like line of clarity. What else? Yeah. That's right. So commonality, similarity, perspective, shared perspective. Anything else made you feel? Yeah. That's right. Like becomes a positively reinforcing cycle, right? You feel this connection, you sense like do they feel it as well? And even when you're not using the language of connection, right? We often don't go around saying like, oh, I connected with someone. But sometimes we do. We have this sense that we had this special conversation. We went to a class, we were doing an activity, we joined an organization, and all of a sudden there was something that differentiated that interaction from others that we were having. So we know that there are actually lots of benefits of social connection. We're happier when we have social connections. We are less stressed out. We end up being more engaged, and we can even be more creative and more innovative as well. And there are general health benefits when we actually feel connected. In fact, Dr. Vivek Murray found that loneliness, and we say that's the antithesis of connection, can actually heighten blood pressure. It can, reduce mental health and wellness. A whole host of things can be deleterious if we're not connected. So yeah, we definitely need it. But it's not just in human beings. Like we see it in other places. So we know that rats help other rats. We know that primates share. We know that we're actually happier when we spend money not just on ourselves, but on others. And that loneliness is actually a greater detriment than smoking, obesity, and as I mentioned, high blood pressure. That's pretty huge, because I don't think we really think hard about what the negative downside is of not being socially connected to others. Okay, so what prevents social connection? You think like, if we all feel so great about it, if we like connecting, then why don't we do it all the time? So there's a study that was conducted by Juliana Schroeder, who is a professor at Berkeley at Haas School, and Nick Epley, who's a professor at Chicago Business School at Booth. And they were interested in, so what keeps people from connecting? So they did what they now affectionately call the Chicago Train Study. Are any of you from Chicago? Yeah? Family is, okay. So Chicago has a train structure. Many of them are elevated. They refer to it as the L. So they thought, and I'm a New Yorker, so I grew up riding the subway, and there are certain norms when you ride the subway. You typically don't speak to the person who like literally could be pressing against you because you're so tightly in there. So there are these norms, and they thought, well, let's go to the Chicago trains and see, like, are people connecting? Why aren't they connecting? How do they feel about it? And so they conducted a study, and they looked at people who were riding the trains, a sophisticated methodology, but they basically had 3 different conditions. And they first wanted to know, okay, if we ask people to imagine having a conversation with a stranger on the train, how would they feel? And you can see there that they felt, relative to solitude, not talking to anyone, that was a much more negative experience in imagining that they were having a conversation. For a different group of people, they said, okay, imagine that you have had a conversation. And that was actually more favorable relative to solitude. So it's this notion of, okay, I imagine I had a conversation, and that seems like it was okay. And then they actually asked another group of people to actually have a conversation with a stranger on the Chicago L train. And actually, after those individuals had that conversation, they felt much more positive relative to solitude. And so it's a really interesting phenomena that we don't want to connect, right? We're apprehensive about it, but we want to have connected. It's kind of akin to going to the gym and working out, or going to boot camp. It's the notion that, like, most of us sort of are dragging in going and doing it. I'm a water jogger, and like I know I should go, but I put it off. Other things, I'm teaching, I'm doing all these other things, they get in the way. After I go, I feel phenomenal. I'm so much more efficient, I have clarity, all of those things. But it's the notion of, Similarly, we want to connect, but we don't want to actually go through connecting, but we want to have it connected because we want those benefits. So how can we get connected? Many social psychologists have done a myriad of studies where they have identified some of what we'll call the levers, the antecedents of forming connections. There are about 12 of them, depending on how you count, and I'll just highlight a little bit about them. So social identity, the extent to which we have some shared category membership, typically that is salient or important to us, that can be the impetus for forming a connection. To the extent that we have done things that build trust, that can help the connection. Pro-social behavior are helping. When we help people, they certainly are likely to feel connected. But the interesting thing about helping behavior is that helping behavior in some instances actually does more good for the person who's doing the helping than it does for the other person. So we can feel connected to someone because we have helped them, which is an interesting phenomenon. When we do things together, social synchrony, we're more likely to feel connected. So if you think of groups that perform together, or teams that play together, or even just doing activities, there's something inherent in that synchrony of doing the same activity that allows us to feel more connected. It's akin to having shared experiences. When we have an understanding of what we're supposed to do, so you came into the classroom and you had an understanding that as it got time for class to start, it was appropriate for you to take your seat, right? It actually means because you understood normatively what was supposed to happen, you feel more connected to this space. If you walked into a place, and I'm sure you've all had the experience of going someplace new, and we're trying to figure out what we're supposed to be doing, where we should be, we're more likely to feel disconnected in those situations. Certainly, when we express liking, when we express gratitude, when we give compliments, those are all things that can foster a connection. The interesting thing about compliments is that we think that other people don't really care about our compliments. But in fact, they care far more. And so noticing something, giving a positive compliment, can have a much more generative impact and foster connection than we would otherwise think. I want to share with you a YouTube video. All right. This is Brian Miller, and he's a magician, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about his craft. I'm going to truncate, so I'll show you a few minutes, and then I'll fast forward it, because it's really elucidating like how he thinks about connection and what he's actually doing.
Thank you. Our world is a shared experience, fractured by individual perspectives, yours and mine. Imagine if we could all understand each other. When I first started my career in magic, I was doing a lot of performing in restaurants, table-to-table card tricks, coin tricks, sleight of hand, and woo. You got a good seat for this. And this one night, I was on fire. I remember it. I was fast and funny. My moves were perfect. I was unstoppable. And I sauntered up to this one table, an elderly man and his wife, and I said, "Folks, would you like to see some magic?" And the man looked at me and he said, "Sir, I would love to see some magic, but I can't. Unfortunately, I'm blind." And I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and it was so clear he was blind. His eyes were glazed. He wasn't really looking at me. Anybody would have known he was blind, but I was so wrapped up in my evening, so lost in my world, I wasn't looking at him. I just saw two generic people, and I launched into my show. And I stood there, embarrassed, and that word was ringing in my ears, blind, blind, blind. And I had no choice. I said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I don't have anything I can do for you, but if you come back again sometime, I promise I'll have some sort of magic I can share with you." He said, "I'll hold you to that," and I went on with my night. A few weeks later, they came back in. I recognized them immediately, and I panicked. I had completely forgotten about it. I raced back to the room where I kept my props, and I was thinking about every trick I'd ever learned, every book I'd ever read, something, anything I can do for this man. And then I remembered something obscure, an obscure idea, something I read a long time ago in an old manuscript. It's all I had. So I Composed myself, I walked back out and I said, "Hey folks, my name is Brian. Would you like to see some magic?" And he cut me off. He goes, "All right, we're back. What do you got for me?" With a big smile on his face. So I asked his wife, "May I sit next to you?" And she said, "Sure." So I sat down and I said, "Ed," his name was Ed. I said, "Ed, do you trust your wife?" He said, "Sometimes." I said, "Will you trust her now?" He said, "Sure." So I took out a pack of playing cards, gave them to her, and said, "Mix the cards, make sure there's no special markings on them." She said, "No, they're fine." I took Ed's hand and I said, "I'm going to place a card in your hand. Do you think this is a red card or a black card?" And he said, "Red." And he was right. Put the next card and he said, "Red." He was right again. I put the next one. He said, "Black." Again, correct. His wife is getting skeptical at this point, and we keep going. Red, red, black, black, red. He's getting all of them right. Red, black, red, faster, black, 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 red through the whole deck, black, black, red. Every single one of them right at the end of it. Ed is laughing. He's howling. The whole restaurant is staring at us, and I turn, and his wife is weeping tears of joy. It was the most beautiful magic I had ever experienced. It seems like a difficult thing to do, to get to know someone's emotional perspective, but let's get back to Ed and his wife. The relevant question for Ed was, what would magic feel like to someone who is blind? I didn't want Ed to feel tricked. That was important to me. I don't know, but I have to imagine if you're blind, you could be tricked by anybody at any time. So I didn't want Ed to feel tricked. I wanted him to feel magic. I wanted him to be magical. And his wife, this woman who spends her life looking out for him, I wanted her to see him in that light and for them to share in that experience together. So if you want to get to know someone's emotional perspective, one of the simplest ways to do it, ask. Ask questions. Too often we're afraid to ask people questions because we feel like it will be rude or somehow they won't want to answer, but we underestimate people's willingness to answer our questions. Before the trick, I asked Ed, "Have you always been blind?" He said yes. To me, that was crucial, relevant information. It seems that a person who has never been able to see will have a different perspective from somebody who had their sight and then lost it to accident or to illness. With Ed, I can't even use the language of sight. So by asking questions, I can adjust my tone, my demeanor, even my language, so that he feels understood and we can make a connection. Now, if you're going to learn this, it's important not simply to ask questions, but to listen to the answers and listen to understand. Don't just listen to respond or to reply. You've heard it before. This is where I went wrong most in my life, I think. You've heard it before, and we're all guilty of it from time to time, but too often we listen to people only with the intention of coming up with something clever to say. So as soon as their lips stop moving, we can jump in and say our thing. We've all done it, we're all guilty of it, but I did this especially badly, and I think to the detriment of my relationships. Have you ever asked for somebody's name and instantly forgotten what it was? You know why we forget people's names? Because while they're telling us their name, we're thinking about how we're gonna say ours. First name, last name, Mr. Miller, Brian, put out your hand. We're not listening. We're on our end of the conversation only. So you can start to learn this technique. Ask questions, listen to understand the answers. When you do that, I think you'll find you can make better, more meaningful connections with people, personally and professionally. It drastically improved my life, and I really believe it can improve yours. So, Ed. How did Ed, a blind man, see the cards? The answer, as in most great magic, was actually very simple. I sat across from him, and underneath the table, I placed my foot gently on top of his. And then I gave him these instructions. I said, if you think the card is a red card, and I pushed my foot down on his once, then you say red. If you think it's a black card, and I pushed my foot down on his twice, then you say black. I was teaching Ed a secret system of communication where I would let him know what color the card was by the foot taps, once for red, twice for black. And I repeated the instructions. If you think it's a red card, say red. If you think it's a black card, say black. And then I squeezed his hand gently and I asked, do you understand? And he smiled and he said, yes, I understand. And I knew then that we had connected. When it was all said and done, I taught his wife how we did it, like I just taught you, so they could go do it for their friends and family. And Ed was so excited, he couldn't wait to see his grandkids that weekend so he could, quote, freak them out completely. See, magic isn't about the technical skill. Magic isn't about a trick or even the secret. Magic is about connecting. Life is about connecting. And connecting is about taking on other points of view. You see, our world is a shared experience, fractured by individual perspectives. Imagine if we could all feel understood. Thank you.
What did you hear Brian Miller say? What's his message? Absolutely. What else? Yeah.
Communication's not always verbal.
It's not always verbal. That's right. What do you mean by that?
Well, like, if you want to, like, if you can connect with someone more, it's like what he said about, like, talk to someone to listen instead of, like, trying to respond.
That's right.
But you can also, like, clearly be more involved in the conversation or connecting with someone if you're, like, you're not closed off in your body language, you're not doing, you're not looking at your phone or something, like,
That's
not
right.
everything is, like, verbal.
That's right. If you're trying to take their perspective, right, to understand how it is that they're sort of sitting and seeing it and to make that connection. What else? What struck you? Yeah.
I like when you said that we underestimate people's like willingness to engage with us. I would feel like as well.
There's actually research that shows that we think people like us a lot less than they actually do. And because we think that they like us less, we don't pursue those relationships, when in fact, if we had an understanding that that wasn't the case, we might form more connections. Yes?
I think if you want to connect, meet people where they are.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, did you see that in this? How so?
Going to Ed, we're finding a way to both connect with Ed physically,
Yes,
but also appeal to Ed's pride.
that's right. That's right.
So we found a way to tap into something that Ed had never really been able to demonstrate before, which was a physical, like a visual sense of humor and understanding.
That's right. And doing it in front of the person who probably love Ed the most, and actually connecting with her as well because of the joy that she saw. And this notion of, we talked about synchrony being a connector, there was a synchrony to what they were doing, right? And a rhythm of doing it together that was forming that bond. Anything else that you take from this? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How important trying to connect is, because the magician, he easily could have just simply like avoided them for the night or went over there and said like, oh, I forgot. Instead he went right to the back room and he tried to come up with something and he came up with an idea to fulfill what he had said the previous time.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, he could have just been more concerned about himself.
That-
He wanted to connect with these people.
He wanted to connect. And you're a little bit more generous because he actually forgot. But as soon as he saw him and heard, he knew, and he was on it. So because he wanted to make good on that. So and that's an important piece of it. And yeah, anything else? Yeah.
I guess kind of like you just said, the importance of making good on your commitments and maintaining connections.
That's right. That's right. Showing up, the consistency notion of it. So you heard that I spent a little bit of time at Airbnb. Have any of you stayed in Airbnbs? So is anyone not familiar with the concept of Airbnb? People have homes and they allow other people to stay in them. It used to be pre-pandemic that you could actually, and you probably still can, rent out rooms in your homes. During the pandemic, that was less prevalent, but that you can, instead of staying in a hotel, you could stay in someone's home. You could rent that out. So you imagine, right? And I know that there are all sorts of marketplaces that you probably participate in. And so Airbnb is a sort of marketplace, right? It's a mediated marketplace. There's a platform. And there are guests and there are hosts. So the hosts are the people who have the entity, the abode, the accommodation, and the guests are looking to stay there. And so as a host, you have the ability to accept anyone, which is called instant book, or you have the ability to look and see who is interested and make determinations on whether you want, that individual, that set of friends, that set of teenagers or under 25 to say, right? And there are all sorts of things that could be going through your mind. What we know is that there's a notion of like, are the people who stay in my home going to be respectable, is the respectful of my place, right? And as we can imagine, how we make determinations about who is going to be respectful or not, there are a lot of things that come in from our lived experience, from our preconceived notions, that factor into that. Okay, so that can lead to people who otherwise, if the host had objective information, would know that they would be perfectly great guests, making a determination that they actually don't want them to stay in their homes. And that results in the loss of money, right? And so if hosts are doing it in part because they want to connect, but also because of the financial remuneration, then they're leaving money on the table. So how can we help individuals get past that? How can we help them get past the preconceived notions that they may have of a particular guest? And so I became interested in connection because I believe that if we can pull some of the levers of connection, then we create a bit of a buffer that then allows people who might otherwise been skeptical to actually get over that and to be more accepting of people coming into their homes. But you can imagine, like, if you put something up on a marketplace and someone wants to purchase it from you and you actually have to go meet them somewhere, what are all the things that go through your head in terms of, like, do you think it's going to be safe? Do you think that you're going to treat this thing appropriately? But what if there were some signal of something that they could do to signal connection? And so going forward, my research, I'm really interested in understanding more of those levers that I showed you on how they can mitigate those preconceived notions that individuals may have, and how we can get individuals to make better, whether it's marketplace or other connections, because they get over it. So imagine you're a guest and you send a message to a host and you say, I saw your place. It's so lovely. I'm planning to come with some friends of mine, and we think it's absolutely perfect. Your decor is great. The way you have things set up is wonderful. We're hoping it will be available. So you've just paid them multiple compliments. The hypothesis would be that perhaps in paying them compliments, they feel more of a connection to you, and any friction that might have gotten in the way of their saying yes to your staying in the place might be somewhat mitigated. Similarly, offers of help. So you can imagine there are a whole host of ways across our marketplaces and digital platforms where we can explore how is it that we can pull levers to foster connection that will allow people to be in contact with one another. And so that's how I'm going to be spending a whole host of time. And for any of you who think that is a little bit interesting and you would like to do some work, please reach out to me. I'd like to take any questions that you might have. Or thoughts? Yes.
Were you looking in general for like more of a business position to try to apply like the whole connections lens, or did Airbnb kind of like come to you? Like, what does that look like?
So I'm a tried and true academic. Then I was sort of business school professor, and I was actually doing some things advancing inclusive excellence, so diversity, equity, and inclusion at another university. But interestingly enough, through connections, someone who knew me not so well, because if they knew me super well, they wouldn't have reached out on LinkedIn, but they literally reached out on LinkedIn, and they said, we're looking for someone to lead our diversity and belonging efforts, and we know you're an academic, but you've done some administrative stuff, and we're wondering whether you would have a conversation with us. So it came through what we would call a weak tie, and then that started the conversation. And it was really interesting to me. I had been a guest on Airbnb for about 5 or 6 years at that time, and had generally good experiences. There were times where I couldn't quite figure out why I couldn't get accommodations, but it wasn't particularly noteworthy. But what I didn't know, I didn't understand Airbnb as an organization. And as someone who studies organizations, it was really intriguing just to figure out, like, oh, wow, how does that actually work? And so decided to go through the conversation process to understand a little bit more about that, and then discovered that they have as their mission to create a world where anyone can belong anywhere. And I spent a lot of time thinking about, I then would have used the language of belonging. It's now morphed into creating connection that fosters belonging, but to have a private company that has its mission fostering belonging was pretty compelling. And so I decided to take a little detour through that. Thank you for asking. What other questions? Yeah.
Would you equate the terms connection and community? Do you feel like there's a little bit of difference there? If so,
So I could give an answer, but I would love for you to posit what you think, or for anyone else.
I don't know. I feel like a community is made out of a bunch of different connections, but
Mhm.
I definitely don't think you can have one without the other. And I feel like there's probably a little more oomph to community.
A little more oomph, a little more oomph. What do others of you think? Are they synonymous?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think it depends on what kind of community you're talking about.
Mhm.
Like, if it's like a sense of community, that's
Yeah.
more of like a belonging to a group of people. But like, I could live in a community and have no connections with anyone there.
Okay.
I think that like in order to have a community and belong to one, you have to then connect with the community. But you can have connections with like individual people
Sure.
and not have the like a communal feeling because maybe there's not a lot of like similarities between you, but you just connect for some reason.
Okay. That works for me. I was thinking as you were talking. So what if there was someone who came from the same neighborhood, that physical community that you didn't know, maybe you didn't even live there at the same time, and then all of a sudden you're here and you discover that, right? And let's say it's not a place that you've met a lot of people from. Is the fact that you both live there, does that provide some connection for you?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Yeah. And so you are members of a community, but because you were part of a community, there were activities that you were engaged in or a way that you saw yourselves as being removed from others that maybe brought even more connection to it. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
yeah, and then kind of on that same note, I think like being from out of state, especially being here where like there's so many people from Virginia, like it is definitely a thing. Like I hear the word New Jersey and immediately I'm like it's just like an automatic connection, and like they could be from 2 hours away from me back in Jersey, but like I automatically like want to talk to them and like want to know where they went to school and like kind of what that was like, because like being from out of state, I don't know as many people as a lot of people here do, and like I'm the only one from my like high school, stuff like that. So I do think like even if that kind of sense of physical community does still foster connections.
Thank you. Yes.
So similarly, actually, I'm from Nova, and a lot of people from UVA are from Nova.
Mhm.
So it's the same sort of feeling where if I hear someone else is from Nova, I definitely want to know where, even if we didn't come from the same county or the
Yeah.
same place, I definitely want to know where they're from. So although I'm not directly connected with them, we did come from an overall community.
That's right. And what's really interesting is there are lots of people from Nova, but even so, knowing that you are from that same location, there's some level of like social similarity or some way that you are connecting as a function of that. Yes.
I'm just curious, like, what future research or studying on connection looks like for you. Like, what does that hold?
Yeah. So there are sort of two methodological directions in which I'm going. So I'm an experimentalist. I have been for quite some time. And so on the experimental front, I really am interested in exploring marketplaces, whether, so it would be creating a scenario, and it could be you're looking for a place to stay with friends, and here are some parameters, and the person or someone you have a home that you are looking to have people stay in, and someone has reached out to you. and then manipulating some of those levers to see if there are differences in the degree to which you would want that person to stay there, how you would evaluate them as a function of maybe some of the characteristics that we can signal. So that's one way to go. The other thing is that we know there's been a fair amount of research in social psychology on levers of connection, although it hasn't been talked about in that same way. It's sort of cobbled together this way to think of them as 12 levers. And really, we know that other disciplines have also explored connection as well. And what I realize is that in order to really understand sort of the foundations of connection, doing it through interviews and of people who are new to certain environments and understanding the connections that they formed and having them take back to like what were those foundational elements of it to really, really understand. So there's an interview qualitative piece to sort of get at the core, and then there's a leveraging of what we already know and see if it mitigates some of the phenomena that we see that can be detrimental in marketplaces. Yes. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on technology and social media in relation to connection? Do you think it adds or detracts?
Oh. That's so hard, right? So I'm gonna give the non-social scientist, like the mother of 3, right? So my youngest is 18, and then I have 21, and I have almost 25. And so I will say, I think we know that there's this, we think that we are more connected, but the reality is those connections are more superficial, and in some ways render us and make us feel lonely because we always think that those connections are out there doing things together in the real world and we're not participating in it. And so there are things that I think about, like I couldn't do my job over the last 20 years if we didn't have the technology for me to be in multiple places and still to be able to engage in my kids' lives in the way that I've been able to. So there are certainly benefits, and those are things that foster connection. Like I've been able to spend more time with friends and family and supporting them because of that, but there's also an illusion, and it would be, there are individuals who are working on it, but it would be great to unpack that to really understand where the line is for benefits and where it becomes more detrimental.
I think I heard that you taught at Batten. So I was just wondering what the policy implications of this would be. Like, what type of, or exactly, how does this research kind of translate into a more policy
Absolutely.
field?
Well, when you think about the absence of connection, and both like in society, but also in organizations, all those downsides of, more voluntary attrition, diminished mental health and wellness, which has real dollar values, all of those things from an organizational standpoint are things that you would want to mitigate, and so fostering connection could be beneficial. When you think more broadly at a societal level, you think about like what are the types of policies that we might want to put into place that would foster practices that would actually improve connection as opposed to diminishing it. And that could include like where do people live and how do we zone things and all of those things that could have an impact. I'm getting the look.
With that, please join me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.